Every pirate ship was chaos at sea, at least that's what we're told. Drunken roguers, blood-soaked cutthroats, cannons firing wild, and captains who ruled with nothing but fear. But the truth is stranger. Behind the smoke and blood, behind the black flags and whispered curses, there was order, discipline, even democracy. Pirates, those so-called devils of the sea, lived and died by rules as strict as any king's decree. Rules written not in ink, but in blood. Imagine it, a dozen nationalities crammed onto a single deck. Men who yesterday might have slit each other's throats, now swearing oaths to share everything: food, drink, gold, and even vengeance. If you broke those rules, you could lose more than your share of treasure. You could lose your life. The pirate code was not a myth, it was real. Every ship had its own articles, read aloud before the voyage began, and every man signed his name or his mark. These codes dictated who got what treasure, how wounds were compensated, when to fight and when to flee. They even outlawed fighting aboard ship, with punishments so brutal that even the most hardened rogue thought twice before crossing the line. And yet, the code was more than law. It was a strange glue that bound these lawless men together, creating floating republics that defied the kings and empires of the age. Some historians whisper that these codes weren't just rules, they were seeds of revolution, the first sparks of democracy on the high seas. But here's the darkest secret. Not all codes were made to keep the crew safe. Some hid traps, words twisted by cunning captains to bind their men tighter than chains. And more than one crew signed their names beneath a rule they would regret until their dying breath. So what exactly did the pirate code say? What strange rules kept cutthroats loyal, and why were men willing to die for them? Tonight, I'll tell you the forbidden laws of the sea, the ones whispered under lantern light, signed with trembling hands, and enforced with cutlasses drawn. And it begins with the oath. The air below deck was heavy with smoke and sweat, the timbers groaning as the Queen's wind howled outside. A single lantern swung from a beam, its light casting jagged shadows across the cramped cabin. On the table lay a sheet of parchment creased, stained, and scrawled with ink that looked almost black as blood. Around it stood men from every corner of the world, English deserters, French sailors, African freedmen, Spanish runaways, all bound together not by country, but by the promise of plunder. The captain sat at the head of the table, his coat patched but his eyes sharp. Beside him, the quartermaster held the quill. His voice carried like a preacher's, though his words were anything but holy. By signing this, he said, tapping the parchment, you bind yourself to the code. No man aboard this ship stands above it, not even the captain. Break it, and the sea herself will judge you. A murmur swept through the men, some nodding, others shifting uneasily. Pirates were not strangers to rules, but to swear themselves to paper, to scratch their names or marks on something that would bind them as surely as iron that was different. Yet the code promised fairness. It promised every man an equal vote, an equal share of loot, even compensation for wounds. One by one, they stepped forward. The first pressed his mark onto the parchment, a jagged X that cut across the lines. Another scrawled a crude name, little more than scratches. A third pricked his finger and let blood drip onto the page, sealing his oath not in ink, but in flesh. As each man signed, the quartermaster read aloud the rules, his voice echoing through the cabin. All plunder is to be divided by shares equal among the crew, save the captain and quartermaster, who take a share and a half. No man may strike another aboard this vessel, settle quarrels on shore, or settle them with pistols at dawn. Gambling with dice is forbidden. Desertion is punishable by death. And every man wounded in battle shall receive compensation, an arm for 400 pieces of 8, a leg for 800, an eye for 100, a finger for 50. The men nodded, some grinning, others grim. These were not rules of mercy, they were rules of survival. With them, no man could claim favoritism, no captain could hoard the spoils, no wound went unrewarded. On a pirate ship, even the crippled had their due. When the last man signed, the captain rose. He placed his hand on the parchment, his fingers spreading wide, and spoke words that silenced the cabin. We are thieves, aye. We are rogues, aye. But with this code, we are brothers. Break it, and you break with us all. Remember that when the gold clinks in your purse and the sea roars for your blood, a cheer went up, rough and ragged. Tankards slammed against the table, boots stamped the planks, voices roared. In that moment, the men were bound not by chains, not by crowns, but by the strange democracy of the code. Yet even as the cheer rose, shadows stirred in the corners. For not every rule was as fair as it seemed. Hidden among the promises of justice were traps clauses, twisted by cunning hands. Words that would one day bind men to a fate darker than any gallows. And those who signed in blood would come to regret the day they placed their mark upon the parchment. For the code was not just law. It was power, and power at sea was as dangerous as any storm. The lantern guttered, the shadows lengthened, and the ship pitched hard to starboard, as though the sea itself had heard their oath. The parchment fluttered, the ink glistening wet, and one man swore he saw the letters writhe as if alive. But when he blinked, it was gone. The code lay still. The oath was sealed, and their fate was no longer their own. The ship rocked gently on the waves, her sails swollen with wind, her deck alive with men who had just sworn themselves to the code. For the first time since leaving port, there was no grumbling, no sharp looks cast at the captain, no fights simmering just beneath the surface. Instead, there was an odd stillness, a fragile peace, born of the parchment signed in shadows below deck. Israel Thatcher, a young gunner, not yet 20, leaned against the rail, eyes wide as he tried to make sense of what he had just witnessed. Pirates' men who stabbed over spilled rum, who slit throats for less than a coin, had signed their names like gentlemen, nodding 2 words read as solemnly as church scripture. The code was no mere set of rules. It had transformed them, bound them tighter than chains. And though Thatcher didn't yet understand why, he felt the shift deep in his bones. The quartermaster, a scarred giant named Briggs, strutted across the deck with the pride of a magistrate. In truth, the quartermaster was no less powerful than the captains, sometimes more. His role was to enforce the code, to ensure fairness, to stand as the crew's voice against tyranny. When a captain grew too greedy or too cruel, it was the quartermaster who stood in his way. The men cheered him almost as loudly as they did the captain, for in him they saw their protector. That evening, the first council under the code was held. The entire crew gathered on the main deck, lanterns swinging from the rigging, waves slapping gently against the hull. The captain addressed them not as a monarch but as an equal, his voice sharp but measured. "Brothers," he said, raising his tankard, "we sail not as slaves to crown or company. We sail as free men. The code is our master now, and by it we will prosper." The men roared, tankards raised high, rum spilling across the planks. But when the noise died, Briggs stepped forward. His tone was calm, but his words carried weight. "Let us test this freedom, then," he said. "Our stores of biscuit are low. The cook says 3 weeks, no more. By the code, the men shall decide. Do we risk a raid, or do we ration?" A hush fell. Normally, such choices belonged to the captain alone. But now, under the code, every man had a vote. The debate raged. Some cried for immediate plunder, hungry for gold and meat. Others warned of risk, of chasing ships too heavily armed. For hours they argued, voices rising, fists pounding. Finally, slips of paper were cast into Briggs's battered hat, scratched with marks crude and uneven. When counted, the verdict was clear. Rationing, the captain scowled, but said nothing. The code had spoken. Israel Thatcher watched in awe. He had served aboard Royal Navy ships, where a common sailor's word meant less than a rat's squeak. There, the captain's will was law, and lashings were swift. Here, among thieves and rogues, a gunner's voice weighed the same as the captain's. For the first time in his life, he felt the taste of freedom, but freedom at sea was a double-edged cutlass. The following week brought their first prize, a fat merchant vessel crawling up from the Caribbean, sails straining under the weight of her cargo. The pirates bore down on her, cannons loaded, muskets primed. Within minutes, the merchantman surrendered, their captain trembling as he offered keys to the hold. The pirates swarmed aboard like locusts, whooping and jeering, dragging barrels, silks, and coin back to the Revenge. Israel Thatcher stumbled under the weight of a chest heavy with silver, his heart hammering. The code promised every man a share. This treasure was his as much as any captain's. When the plunder was tallied, Briggs once again read the code. The captain and quartermaster would take a share and a half, the other officers a share and a quarter, and every man a share. The distribution began, piles of coin glinting in lantern light. The men grinned, slapped each other's backs, and sang shanties as their pockets grew heavy. But then came the wounded. One man, his arm torn by a musket ball, slumped against the mast. Another limped, his leg mangled by splinters. Briggs announced their compensation, the sums dictated by the code itself. 400 pieces of 8 for the arm, 800 for the leg. The coins were counted and set aside, drawn not from the captain's purse, but from the whole. Some men grumbled, unhappy to see their shares lessened. But the wounded gripped Briggs's hand with tears in their eyes. For in the cruel world of the sea, no other lawn, neither crown nor company, had ever promised them such justice. Here, even the broken could live without begging. It was then that Israel Thatcher understood. The code was not kindness. It was survival. It kept knives sheathed, grudges cooled, and fear at bay. With it, the ship became a republic of rogues, each man bound not by loyalty to a king, but by loyalty to each other. Yet democracy is a fragile flame, easily snuffed by wind or greed. One night, weeks later, a fight broke out over dice. Though gambling was forbidden, 2 men had played in secret, and accusations of cheating turned to fists. The crew dragged them before Briggs, who unrolled the code with solemn hands. "No fighting aboard ship," he read, his voice grim. "The penalty is marooning." The men paled. Marooning meant being left on a barren island with a pistol and a single shot. To live or die alone, the crew voted as the code demanded. The verdict was unanimous. At dawn, the two men were rowed ashore to a spit of sand no bigger than a gull's wing. They begged, they wept, but the pirates turned their backs. The code had spoken, and its judgment was final. As the longboat pulled away, Israel Thatcher shivered. He had thought pirates lawless devils, but here was law stricter than any king's, stricter and colder. That night the men drank heavily, their laughter hollow, for though they had enforced the code, they had also buried brothers. And in the silence that followed, Thatcher heard one man whisper, "Whose law is this, truly? Ours or the captain's?" The question lingered like smoke, curling into every corner of the ship. For while the code promised equality, it was the captain and quartermaster who interpreted it, who decided when to enforce it, when to bend it. And not every man trusted their judgment. The next morning, Thatcher awoke to find the captain standing at the rail, staring into the horizon. His face was unreadable, but his voice carried on the wind. "The code keeps us free," he murmured, "but freedom has a price." Israel Thatcher swallowed hard, staring at the parchment folded in Briggs's coat. Freedom, yes, but whose freedom? The men's, the captain's, or the sea's? And as the ship sailed on, the parchment seemed to grow heavier with every wave, its words binding them tighter, its promises darker than they dared admit. The code had saved them from chaos, but it had also chained them, and chains, even of parchment, can strangle. The code had been signed, the rules agreed, the punishments enforced. The Revenge now sailed, not as a mob of rogues, but as a republic at least on the surface. Yet beneath the calm, the sea of men roiled with currents darker than any storm. Israel Thatcher felt it keenly. The code bound the men together, yes, but it also sharpened the edge of their differences. Every rule was a line in the sand, every vote a reminder that freedom was fragile, balanced on the knife edge of greed and vengeance. And nothing tested the code more than blood. It began with a raid. The Revenge spotted a fat brigantine off Hispaniola, her sails heavy, her decks crowded with cargo. Black smoke curled from her galley chimney, a sign she carried food. The pirates bore down on her, cannons booming, muskets cracking. The brigantine fired back, desperate to defend her cargo. But she was no match for the black sails and 40 guns of the Revenge. Israel Thatcher worked his cannon like a madman, ears ringing, arms aching. The roar of iron on iron filled the air, smoke choking the deck. Then came the grappling hooks, the crash of wood on wood, the screams as pirates swarmed aboard, cutlasses flashing. The battle was short and brutal. The brigantine's crew fell quickly, their captain cut down where he stood. The pirates whooped as they dragged barrels of food and casks of wine across the planks, their laughter rising above the moans of the dying. But amid the chaos, a quarrel broke out. Two pirates, both scarred veterans, both drunk on blood and rum, argued over a necklace torn from a merchant's throat. One claimed he'd struck the man first, the other swore he'd wrenched it from the corpse. Their shouting grew louder, knives flashing. Before anyone could intervene, steel met flesh. Blood sprayed across the deck, and one man fell, gasping. The necklace tangled in his fingers. The code was clear: no fighting aboard ship. The penalty was death or marooning. The crew dragged the survivor before Briggs, the quartermaster, while the dead man's body was tossed into the sea. Lanterns flickered as the men gathered, their faces grim. Briggs unrolled the parchment, his voice steady. Rule 3: no man shall quarrel or strike another aboard ship. Any who draw steel against a brother shall face judgment by the crew. The accused spat blood, his eyes blazing. He cheated me. That bauble was mine. It matters not, Briggs said coldly. The code is the law. The men voted. Some argued for mercy after all. The dead man could not protest. Others demanded blood. In the end, the verdict was unanimous. The pirate would be marooned. At dawn, they left him on a barren quay, his pistol and shot placed in the sand beside him. He shouted curses as they rowed away, his voice carrying across the waves. Israel Thatcher watched in silence, his stomach twisting. This was justice, but it was justice colder than steel. The crew said nothing that night. They drank, they sang, but the laughter was hollow. The necklace, the cursed trinket that had sparked the quarrel, was tossed into the sea. No man dared touch it. For a time, the code held, but the sea tests all bonds. Weeks later, as the Revenge sailed through calm waters, another conflict arose, not over gold, but over women. The code forbade bringing women aboard ship, fearing jealousy and violence. Yet one pirate had smuggled a woman from the last raid, hiding her in the hold. She was discovered when her cries echoed through the planks, drawing the crew like moths to flame. The quartermaster dragged the trembling girl onto the deck, her eyes wide with terror. The man who had hidden her stood defiant, daring the crew to judge him. Rule 7, Briggs intoned, his voice heavy. No women or boys are to be brought aboard. The penalty is death. The men argued long into the night. Some demanded mercy, claiming the girl had been taken against her will and should be freed at the next port. Others demanded her death, fearing she was a curse, a distraction that would bring ruin. The man who had smuggled her stood tall, swearing he would protect her, cutlass flashing in the torchlight. It came to a vote. The verdict: the woman would be set free on the next shore. The man flogged for breaking the code. The flogging was brutal. 30 lashes across the back, each strike tearing flesh, blood spraying across the planks. The man gritted his teeth, refusing to cry out, but by the end he collapsed, unconscious, his skin shredded. The crew watched in silence, their faces pale. Israel Thatcher felt bile rise in his throat. He had seen men hanged by the navy, whipped by captains, but this was pirates punishing their own by their own law. The sea was cruel, but the code was crueler still. The woman was freed days later, set ashore with food and coin. She vanished into the jungle without a word. The man who had smuggled her lived, but his back bore scars that never healed. From then on, the men grew restless. The code kept them alive, yes, but it also bound them in ways they had never imagined. It told them when to eat, when to fight, when to bleed. It gave them freedom, but only within chains. Israel Thatcher began to hear whispers, men questioning whether the code was truly theirs, or whether it was just another set of shackles, forged by captains who wanted power without calling it tyranny. One night, in the glow of lanterns, Thatcher heard Briggs and the captain arguing. "The men grow restless," Briggs said. "They think the code serves you more than them." The captain's voice was cold. "The code serves the ship, and the ship serves me. That is not how it was written. That is how it will be." The words chilled Thatcher to the bone. The code, meant to bind rogues in brotherhood, was twisting, becoming a weapon in the hands of the strong. And as the Revenge sailed on into darker waters, Thatcher realized the truth. Brotherhood and blood were never far apart, and soon The code would demand more blood than the sea itself. The Revenge cut through dark waters like a blade. Her sails hung heavy, her timbers groaning, her deck alive with whispers. The code had bound the crew together, but now it seemed to bind them in chains. Every man felt the weight of parchment and ink pressing on his shoulders. Every decision a reminder that freedom had teeth. Israel Thatcher knew it better than most. He had seen men flogged, marooned, and left for dead all in the name of fairness. The code promised justice, aye, but justice was a cruel mistress. And as the Revenge drifted into the Caribbean heat, the tension on board grew sharper than cutlass steel. The test came on a sweltering night. The sea was flat as glass, the stars blazing overhead, the men restless with boredom and thirst. Rum had run low, water staler than bilge, and food crawling with weevils. The crew muttered in the shadows, their voices low and dangerous. Then it happened. A shout split the night one. Man accused another of stealing from the stores. The cry echoed across the deck like cannon fire. In an instant, knives were drawn, fists raised, curses flying. The code forbade fighting aboard ship, but hunger and rage burned hotter than parchment law. Israel Thatcher shoved through the chaos, his heart hammering. 2 men grappled near the mainmast, blood glistening on one's blade. The crew surged around them, shouting, some urging restraint, others calling for blood. Then the captain's voice cut through the night like thunder. Enough. He strode across the deck, his coat billowing, his eyes alight with fury. The men froze, their knives trembling in the lantern light. The accused and the accuser glared at each other, panting like beasts, but lowered their blades. The quartermaster stepped forward, the parchment code in his hands. His voice was cold, sharp as steel. Rule 3. No man shall strike another aboard ship. The penalty is death or maroning. The men held their breath. They had seen it before, judgment swift, punishment merciless. But this time was different. Both men swore innocence. One claimed theft, the other swore false witness. Neither backed down, and the crew split in their loyalties. It was decided, a trial by the code. The crew gathered under the swaying lanterns, a crude court upon the open sea. The captain stood silent, arms folded, eyes burning. The quartermaster read the charges, his voice echoing. Witnesses were called, each man giving his word, some siding with the accuser, others with the accused. The air grew hotter, thicker, sweat dripping from brows as voices clashed finally. The quartermaster raised his hand. By the code, the crew shall vote. Israel Thatcher's stomach twisted. A man's life hung on the scrape of chalk marks in a battered hat. One by one, the men cast their votes, their faces grim. When the tally was read, the verdict was guilty. The condemned stood pale, his lips trembling. I swear by the sea, I stole nothing, he whispered, but the code had spoken. At dawn, the crew gathered in silence. The man was bound to the mainmast, his shirt torn, his chest bare. The captain drew his pistol, his face carved from stone. He raised it, aimed, and fired. The shot cracked across the water. The man slumped, blood pooling at his feet. The crew stood in silence. No cheers, no jeers only. The sound of the waves slapping against the hull. The body was cast into the sea, the water swallowing him whole. Israel Thatcher stared at the ripples until they faded. He felt the weight of the code pressing on his chest, heavier than chains. Justice, about what if it had been wrong? What if the man had told the truth? The question gnawed at him. The crew returned to their duties, but the air aboard the Revenge had changed. The code had claimed another life, and the men no longer whispered of freedom. They whispered of fear. Weeks later, another raid brought more plunder, more blood. But the victory was hollow. Gold clinked in their pouches, yet their laughter rang false. The code had kept order, but at the cost of trust. Every man eyed his brother warily, wondering who would next be condemned by chalk and ink. The turning point came with fire. It was a raid gone wrong, a Spanish warship disguised as a merchant. The pirates struck fast, boarding with cutlasses raised, but the Spaniards fought back with fury. Muskets roared, cannons thundered, steel clashed in the smoke. Israel Thatcher fought like a demon, powder stinging his nose, blood slicking the deck beneath his boots. Then came the fire, a spark, a flash, and the powder store erupted. Flames roared up the rigging, sails igniting like tinder. Smoke choked the air, men screaming as their flesh burned. The Spaniards pressed their attack, forcing the pirates back. The captain bellowed orders, his pistol smoking, his cutlass dripping blood. "Hold the line." He roared, but panic had taken root. Some men fought, others fled, diving into the sea to escape the flames. The deck became a hellscape of fire and blood. The code forgotten in the chaos. Israel Thatcher stumbled through the smoke, his lungs burning. He saw Briggs, the quartermaster, clutching the parchment code even as the fire licked at its edges. The law? Briggs gasped, his eyes wild. The code must not burn, but the flames were merciless. The parchment curled, blackened, crumbled to ash in his hands. Briggs screamed, clutching the embers, until a musket ball struck him down. The pirates rallied, somehow seizing the warship, but their losses were heavy. The dead littered the deck, the wounded groaned, the air reeked of charred flesh, and the code, their law, their bond was gone. That night, under a blood-red moon, the survivors gathered in silence. The captain stood before them, his face grim, his voice low. "The code is ash," he said. "The law is gone." The men shifted uneasily, their eyes darting. Without the code, they were nothing but rogues, again lawless, chaotic, dangerous. Then the captain's eyes blazed. "So we write a new one." And in that moment, Israel Thatcher realized the truth. The code was never more than paper and ink, twisted by those who held it. It was not fairness. It was not freedom. It was power, and power, at sea, was always written in blood. The lanterns flickered. The shadows deepened, and the sea seemed to whisper. What would this new code demand? What price would it exact? For on the waves there was always a price. The sea was calm, but the Revenge was not. Smoke still clung to her timbers from the fire that had devoured the old code. The men moved about their duties in silence, their eyes hollow, their hands twitching on ropes and knives. Without the parchment, the balance of their strange democracy had collapsed. What remained was tension, sharp and deadly, like a cutlass held just out of sight. Israel Thatcher felt it in every glance, every whispered word. Before, the code had been the shield between them, unforgiving eye, but clear. It had told them when to bleed, when to share, when to punish. Now there was nothing but the captain's voice and the men's fear. And fear, Thatcher knew, was a powder keg waiting for a spark. The captain wasted no time. 2 days after the fire, he summoned the crew to the quarterdeck. The sun blazed overhead, sweat dripping down brows, the men squinting into the light as they gathered. The captain stood tall, his coat scorched, his cutlass gleaming. In one hand he held scraps of charred parchment, in the other a quill. "The code is ash," he said, his voice carrying across the deck. "But law we must have, or we are nothing but beasts. So we will write anew." The crew muttered, uneasy. Some nodded, eager for order. Others scowled, distrust in their eyes. The quartermaster was dead, the parchment gone, and the men knew too well how icily rules could be twisted. Still, the captain pressed on. "We will draft fresh articles," he declared. "Every man shall vote, as before. But mark me this time, the law will not be so easily burned." He spread the scraps on a barrel, dipping the quill into ink. The men crowded around, their faces lit by greed and suspicion alike. One by one, they shouted their demands: more shares for gunners, double rum for the night watch, protection for the wounded. The captain nodded, scratching lines in dark strokes, his face unreadable. But Thatcher, watching closely, saw the trap. The captain's hand lingered on certain lines, twisting words, shaping them into snares. "The captain shall have 2 votes in council," he wrote. "The captain may override the crew in matters of danger." The men, drunk on the promise of silver and rum, cheered these words, blind to the chains tightening around their necks. By sunset, the new code was complete. It was read aloud, signed with trembling hands, sealed with blood. The men cheered, slamming tankards, stamping boots. But Thatcher's stomach churned. This was no republic. This was tyranny dressed as fairness. The captain had bound them tighter than iron shackles, and they had cheered as he did it. The test came swiftly. 3 nights later, a storm lashed the Revenge, waves pounding her hull, sails snapping like whips. Amid the chaos, a man was caught stealing rum from the stores. He was dragged before the captain, soaked and trembling, the sea roaring around them. By the code, the captain declared, the penalty is death. The men hesitated. The old code had given them voice, had demanded a vote, but the new code gave the captain power to decide in matters of danger. And with the storm raging, none dared challenge him. The captain drew his pistol, raised it high, and fired. The man crumpled, his body sliding across the slick deck before vanishing into the waves. The storm swallowed his scream. The men said nothing. They returned to their ropes, their eyes dark. But Thatcher saw the truth. The code no longer protected them. It enslaved them. From that night, whispers of betrayal spread like rot. Men met in secret, crouched in the shadows of the hold, their voices low and bitter. Some wanted to seize the ship, to cut down the captain and cast the new code into the sea. Others urged patience, fearing the gallows if they failed. Thatcher listened, torn. He had once believed in the code, had felt its promise of fairness. But now it was nothing but a mask for tyranny, and the mask was slipping. The breaking point came with a prize. Off the coast of Nassau, the Revenge intercepted a Dutch merchantman, fat with sugar and coin. The battle was quick, the plunder rich. The men cheered, dragging barrels and chests across the deck, their greed momentarily drowning their fear. But when the spoils were tallied, the captain declared a new decree. By the code, he said, a double share shall be mine, and half a share from every man to repair the ship. The crew erupted. Shouts, curses, fists shaking in the air. This was theft, plain and simple. The old code had divided spoils fairly. Now the captain bled them under the guise of law. Israel Thatcher felt the spark ignite. Men reached for knives, for pistols. The deck became a tinderbox. Every word a match. Then Briggs's successor, an unsteady man named Doyle, thrust into the role of quartermaster, stepped forward. His voice trembled, but he spoke. The men will not stand for this. The code is twisted. The crew calls for vote. The captain's eyes blazed. He raised his cutlass, pointing it at Doyle's chest. The crew calls for nothing. I am the law. The silence that followed was heavier than cannon shot. The crew stood frozen, torn between fear and rage. Then Thatcher saw Ither flicker in their eyes. The shift of weight toward weapons, the decision being made. Mutiny. It erupted like a storm. Men surged forward, blades flashing, pistols cracking. The captain roared, his cutlass cutting a bloody path through the rebels. Doyle fell first, his throat opened, blood spraying across the deck. Others followed, cut down in the frenzy. The deck became a slaughterhouse, the air thick with smoke and screams. Thatcher fought with the rebels, his heart pounding, his cutlass slick with blood. For a moment, it seemed they might succeed. The captain, outnumbered, surrounded. But he fought like a demon, his fury unstoppable, his pistol barking, his blade flashing. One by one, the rebels fell, until only Thatcher remained, panting, bleeding, his blade trembling in his hand. The captain loomed over him, smoke curling from his pistol. His eyes were wild, his voice a snarl. You think to break the code? You think to break me? Thatcher spat blood, his voice hoarse. This ain't the code, it's chains. The captain raised his pistol, aimed at Thatcher's head. For a moment, the world held its breath. Then a wave struck the hull, the ship shuddered, and the shot went wide. Thatcher seized the moment. He lunged, driving his blade into the captain's side. The man roared, staggered, but did not fall. His cutlass swung, grazing Thatcher's arm. But the young gunner pressed on, shoving him back toward the rail. The crew watched in silence, their faces pale, their loyalty shattered. Some reached for weapons, others backed away, unwilling to choose. The captain and Thatcher clashed in the storm, their blades sparking, their boots sliding on blood. At last, with a cry, Thatcher drove the captain against the rail. The man teetered, his eyes blazing, his mouth curling into a smile even as blood poured from his side. Strike me down, he hissed. But no, this the sea takes her own. Thatcher shoved. The captain toppled, vanishing into the waves. The deck fell silent. The storm howled, the sea roared, but the men said nothing. The captain was gone, the tyrant dead, the code broken once more. But freedom did not taste sweet. It tasted of blood and salt and ashdot. The crew gathered in silence, their eyes hollow. Doyle lay dead, others beside him. The deck was slick with gore, the sails tattered, the future uncertain. The republic of rogues had devoured itself, the promise of fairness drowned in betrayal. Israel Thatcher stood among the corpses, his cutlass dripping, his heart hollow. He had fought for freedom, but what remained? No code, no captain, no brotherhood, only ghosts. The sea stretched endless around them, black and pitiless. And Thatcher knew the truth at last. Pirates had no masters but hunger and fear. The code was never salvation. It was only another chain, and chains always broke. Yet even in the silence, a question lingered: what law would they write now? And who would pay the price? The captain was gone, swallowed by the waves. His last words clung to the men like smoke. The sea takes her own. Israel Thatcher stood at the rail, chest heaving, cutlass slick with blood. Around him, the deck was littered with bodies, the quartermaster Doyle. Rebels cut down in fury, loyalists who had backed the wrong man. The Revenge creaked and groaned beneath their feet, her sails tattered, her timbers soaked in crimson. For the first time in weeks, the crew was leaderless. No captain, no quartermaster, no code, only silence, broken by the slap of waves and the cries of gulls circling above. The men stared at Thatcher, some with gratitude, others with suspicion. He had driven the tyrant into the sea. About what now? Freedom is a heavy chain when there is no hand to guide it. One by one, they drifted into clusters, whispering, glancing at Thatcher with wary eyes. He knew what they were thinking. The sea does not tolerate a vacuum. A new captain must be chosen. A new code must be written. That night, under lantern light, the crew gathered on deck. The bodies had been cast overboard, their blood trailing in the wake. The air was heavy, the stars cold above. A grizzled boatswain named Mallory spoke first. "We cannot sail without law. We cannot sail without a captain." Another man shouted back, "And what good did law do us? What good did captains bring, save chains and death?" Voices rose, anger simmering. Some demanded a fresh code, a return to fairness. Others spat, calling the code a curse, a trick that had turned brothers into enemies. At last all eyes turned to Thatcher. He felt the weight of their stares, the expectation pressing down like an anchor. He had no wish to command, no thirst for power, but in the silence he heard himself speak. "We are not beasts," he said. "Without rules, we'll tear each other apart." But the code we wrote was twisted. Too much power in one man's hand, too much blood spilled in the name of law. If we write again, it must be different. It must protect us from tyrants and from ourselves. The men muttered, some nodding, others frowning. Mallory spat into the sea. "And who shall write it? You." Thatcher's jaw tightened. "Not me. All of us, together. No captain's quill. No tricks in the ink. We write plain, we write fair, and we all sign." The murmurs grew louder. Some cheered, others jeered. The debate raged deep into the night, rum fueling tempers, fists pounding barrels. In the end, desperation won. The men agreed. A new code would be drafted at dawn. But dawn brought no peace as the first light broke. The sea turned strange. The wind died, the sails hung limp, and the Revenge drifted in eerie calm. The water was too still, the air too quiet, the horizon too empty. The men stirred uneasily, muttering of omens and curses. Then they heard it, a sound rising from the deep. A slow, steady throb. A heartbeat. Israel Thatcher froze. He had heard it before below deck, in the hold, where the old captain had whispered to shadows. He thought it gone, swallowed with the man into the waves. But now it returned, louder, closer, rattling the timbers. The crew panicked. Some clutched knives, others dropped to their knees, praying. Mallory roared for silence, but the men's fear was louder. The sea itself seemed alive, the water trembling beneath them, and then the dead returned. Shapes rose from the waves, pale and bloated. Faces Thatcher recognized, men cast overboard, men marooned. Men executed by the code. Their eyes glowed faintly blue, their mouths opening in silence. They clung to the hull, their hands dragging across the planks, their voices whispering in unison. The sea takes her own. The men screamed, firing pistols into the water, slashing with cutlasses. But the bullets passed through mist. The blades struck nothing. Still the shapes climbed, their fingers reaching, their whispers louder. The Revenge groaned, her timbers cracking, her sails tearing as though gripped by unseen hands. The heartbeat thundered now, shaking the deck, rattling bones. Thatcher staggered, his vision swimming, the sound in his skull, and then, above it all, he heard laughter. From the waves rose the captain, his coat drenched, his beard dripping, his eyes blazing with unholy fire. He clutched a broken scrap of parchment in one hand, its ink smeared but its words glowing faintly. "You thought to cast me down?" he roared, his voice carrying across the water. "But I am bound not by rope nor by steel, but by the code itself. The sea honors her bargains, and I am her chosen." The men reeled, their courage breaking. Some fell to their knees, others fled across the deck, but there was nowhere to run. The captain climbed aboard, water streaming from his boots, his cutlass gleaming in the dawn light. Thatcher raised his own blade, heart pounding. "You're no captain," he spat. "You're a curse." The captain smiled, smoke curling from his lips. And curses cannot die. The battle was chaos. Men clashed with shadows, their blades striking only water. The revenant crew swarmed the deck, dragging screaming pirates into the waves. Thatcher fought like a madman, his cutlass slick, his lungs burning. He cut 1, 2, 3 shapes, but they dissolved only to rise again. At the quarterdeck he faced the captain. Their blades met, sparks flying, the deck slick with seawater and blood. The heartbeat thundered, shaking their bones, as though the sea itself cheered the duel. "Strike me down," the captain taunted, his eyes blazing. "But no, this the sea will always claim her due. Kill me, and another will rise. Kill me, and you will wear the chains." Thatcher roared, driving forward, his cutlass plunging into the captain's chest. The man staggered, blood no, salt water gushing from the wound. His mouth curled into a smile, his hand clamping onto Thatcher's wrist. "You are captain now," he whispered, and then he dissolved, his body crumbling into mist, vanishing into the sea. The revenants screamed, their forms scattering, dissolving into foam. The heartbeat faded, the sea grew still, the dawn light breaking across calm waters. The crew collapsed, gasping, their eyes wide with terror. Thatcher stood at the quarterdeck, his blade trembling, his chest heaving. Around him, the men slowly rose, their faces pale, their eyes fixed on him. He realized the truth with a chill deeper than death. By killing the captain, he had taken his place. The code, whatever dark force bound it, had chosen him. The men cheered weakly, hailing him as captain. But Thatcher felt only dread, for in the silence, he still heard it, a heartbeat slow, steady, growing louder. The code was not gone. It lived in him now, and the sea would claim her due. The pirate code was no mere set of rules. It was a curse, a bargain with the sea itself, binding men in ink, blood, and salt water. Captains rose and fell, but the code endured, feeding on fear, on loyalty, on betrayal, and if you think it died with Blackbeard, with Bartholomew Roberts, with all the rogues who signed their names in shadow, think again. Some say In forgotten coves and wrecks, the old parchments still wait. Some say, if you listen on calm nights, you can hear the heartbeat of the code itself, echoing beneath the waves. If you thought this tale was wild, wait until you hear the next untold pirate story. One darker, bloodier, and closer to truth than you dare imagine. Subscribe and join me on the next voyage into the forbidden waters of history.